cleaned the valve, and gotten together the tools you need, you're ready to begin disassembly. Disassembly starts at the top of the valve with the removal of the hand lifting assembly. The first part to be removed is the pivot pin, which is usually locked in place with a cotter pin. As with all the other parts you'll remove in the course of disassembly, handle these parts carefully and set them aside where you can find them later on. Once the pivot pin is out of the way, the lifting lever can be removed. Next comes the cap. The cap protects the top of the spindle, the lifting nut and its lock nut, and the compression screw. It's usually held in place by a set screw. At the top of the spindle is a lock nut and the lifting nut. Use a pair of wrenches to break them free. Then, turn them off the spindle and set them aside. The lock nut holding the compression screw in place should be broken free next. Again, use a pair of wrenches, but be certain that the wrenches you use are matched to these parts. Otherwise, you could round off the flats of the screw and its lock nut. It's not necessary to remove the lock nut from the compression screw. Just back it away from the yoke. Remember that the compression screw is precisely adjusted to maintain exactly the right amount of tension on the valve spring. So that you can return it to its original place when you reassemble the valve, you have to keep a record of its position. One way to do this is to make two small witness marks, one on the top of the yoke and the other on the flat surface of the screw itself. By setting a divider so that one tip is in each witness mark, the distance between the tips of the divider becomes your record of the distance between the witness marks. When using this method, it's extremely important to put the divider where its setting won't be changed, either by its falling on the floor or being picked up by another mechanic. To prevent any possible error when installing the compression screw later on, always make a second record of its original position. The easiest way to do this is to count the number of turns it takes to disengage the compression screw from the threads in the yoke. Using the witness marks as a guide, count each time the screw completes a turn. When the compression screw is loose enough, you can turn it by hand, but continue counting. Each time the witness marks pass each other, count another full turn. Stop counting only when you feel the threads disengage. Then lift the compression screw off the top of the spindle and set it aside. Immediately write down the number of turns it took to free the screw. Don't rely on your memory. Next, break the yoke nuts free and remove them from their studs. When the last nut has been removed, lift the yoke off the valve body. Be careful not to bang the yoke against the studs or the spindle, and set the yoke aside where it's safely out of the way. At this point, it's a good idea to set up a pair of V-blocks so you have a safe place to put the spindle when you remove it. Remove the spindle and the feather by lifting straight up to avoid banging the feather against the sides of the casing. A feather that's even slightly damaged will not function properly. Separate the spindle and the feather. Then set the spindle on the V-blocks and place the feather on the table's seating surface up so it's not damaged by contact with the table. Looking straight down through the top of the valve body, you can see that the upper adjusting ring and the lower adjusting ring are exposed. Because their position is critical to the function of the valve, measurements must be taken before they're removed. the exact position of the upper ring is measured first. This graphic will give you a clearer picture of how this first measurement is taken. A rigid rule is laid across the lip of the valve body. Then a second rule is placed vertically with its end flat against the top of the upper ring. The measurement is taken on the vertical rule at the point where it intersects with the horizontal rule. Using this method, you get an accurate measurement of the distance between the top of the upper ring and the lip of the valve body. When you get an accurate reading on the vertical rule, write the measurement down. As the mechanic's notes show, the distance between the top of the upper ring and the lip of the valve body is 5/8 of an inch. After recording this first measurement, remove the upper adjusting ring. This is done by first cutting and removing the locking wire that holds the upper ring and lower ring locking pins in place. The upper locking pin is then broken free. And removed from the valve body. This frees the upper adjusting ring, which is removed by simply unscrewing it until it comes free. Check the ring for any obvious signs of wear or damage. Then set it aside where it won't fall on the floor or get banged around. The next step is to record the position of the lower adjusting ring. Here, the mechanic is using a lapping block, but a rigid rule will work just as well as long as it's perfectly straight. He lays the lapping block flat on the valve seat. Then he breaks the lower adjusting ring locking pin free. And removes it from the valve body. This frees the lower ring so that it can be turned. Next, the mechanic uses a screwdriver to reach into the valve body through the lower locking pinhole. Looking through the top of the valve, we can see that he's using the screwdriver to turn the lower ring. He carefully counts the number of notches that move past the pinhole as the ring turns. When the lower ring touches the lapping block, he stops. He immediately writes down the number of notches that he counted, in this case, 10. This gives him the information he needs for reinstalling the lower ring in its original position later on. He then removes the lapping block and turns the lower ring until it disengages from the threads in the valve body. He removes the ring, briefly inspects it for obvious signs of wear or damage, and sets it aside. All that remains now is to remove the spring and the spring washers from the yoke. This is done very simply by tilting the top of the spring outward. A quick inspection will tell you whether or not these parts are in good condition. The spring and the washers are a match set.